In the early morning of March 17, 1859, the house servants entered the master bedroom of the main house at Beaumont Plantation in rural Georgia. The heat was suffocating even before dawn. They found young Thomas Beaumont, heir to one of the most powerful families in the state, lying in his mahogany bed imported from France. His face wore an expression no one could decipher, agony mixed with something that looked like peace. But it wasn't his death at age 28 that scandalized all of Savannah. It was what they found beside the body. A slave named only as Elias, with eyes red from crying, holding the young master's hand as if they were equals. And on the writing desk, dozens of letters tied with silk ribbon, all addressed to him. The will lay open, the ink still fresh. Thomas had freed Elias and left him land and enough money to start a new life. But the last line of the document froze the blood of everyone who read it. Elias was not my slave. He was the love of my life. And I chose to love him even knowing the price. Before we continue, check if you're already subscribed to the channel and write in the comments which country you're watching this video from. This story has been silenced for over 160 years. American history books never mentioned what happened at Beaumont Plantation, but the diaries survived, the letters were preserved, and witnesses left testimonies that today allow us to reconstruct one of the most forbidden love stories of the American South. What you're about to hear now is not fiction. It's the truth that Southern plantation families paid fortunes to bury. Savannah, Georgia, July 1853. The slave market on Bay Street operated every Wednesday and Saturday, right after morning services. The smell of the ocean mixed with human sweat, and the scent of magnolia coming from the gardens of colonial houses. The sun reflected off whitewashed walls with a violence that made eyes burn. Thomas Beaumont was only 22 years old, but already carried the weight of being the only male son of Colonel Augustus Beaumont, owner of 3 cotton plantations and more than 200 slaves. His father was old and sick, and Thomas needed to learn to manage the empire that would one day be his. That morning, he was there to buy labor for the approaching harvest season. He wore a white linen suit, straw hat, and leather boots imported from England. In everyone's eyes, he was the perfect portrait of a future plantation master, educated in Europe, voracious reader, devout Baptist. But Thomas kept a secret. Even he didn't fully understand. He felt like a stranger in his own skin, prisoner to a destiny he hadn't chosen. His engagement to Cecilia Thornton, daughter of another great landowner, had been arranged since they were children. The union would seal a political and economic alliance. There was no love there, only convenience. Thomas accepted everything with resignation, like someone serving an inevitable sentence. He was distracted, examining land ownership documents, when the auctioneer announced Lot 23. The man's voice, normally strong and commercial, hesitated for an instant. Young man, 18 years old, can read and write, worked in a family home in Charleston. Name, Elias. Thomas raised his eyes, and the world stopped. Elias stood on the platform, hands tied in front of his body. His skin was the color of dark honey, his black eyes deep and seemed to hold a sharp intelligence. But there was something more, something Thomas couldn't name. The way Elias kept his head raised, even in chains, the dignity that emanated from him like an invisible light. The other buyers murmured among themselves, suspicious. A literate slave was dangerous, they said, could forge documents, incite rebellions. The starting price was low because of this distrust. Thomas should have passed, should have chosen stronger, more submissive workers, but something held him there, a force he didn't understand. His eyes met Elias's for a second, just 1 second, and in that instant, something silent and terrifying passed between them. $400, Thomas said with a firm voice, surprising even himself. No one else bid. Within minutes, Elias was the legal property of Thomas Beaumont. When they signed the papers, the clerk commented, "Be careful with that one, young sir. Eyes too smart for a Negro." Thomas didn't respond. He just watched Elias being led to the wagon that would transport him to Beaumont Plantation. And as the vehicle disappeared down the red clay road, Thomas felt he had just bought much more than a slave. He had just sealed his own fate. The journey from Savannah to the plantation took 2 days. Thomas rode in front. Elias went in the wagon with other newly purchased slaves. But when they stopped to rest, Thomas couldn't help but observe him. He saw how Elias helped the weaker ones, how he shared the water given to him, how his eyes studied the landscape as if memorizing every detail. On the second night, they camped near a river. The slaves were placed in a fenced area, watched by overseers. Thomas was in his tent when he heard raised voices. He came out and saw one of the guards threatening Elias with a whip, accusing him of looking with disrespect. "Stop!" ordered Thomas with an authority that surprised the men. "This slave will work in the main house. I don't want marks on him." The overseer backed away, grumbling. Elias kept his head down, but Thomas saw his shoulders relax slightly. That night, lying in his makeshift bed, Thomas couldn't sleep. He thought about how he'd protected Elias, the impulse that led him to intervene. Something was changing inside him, and he didn't know if he should be afraid or relieved. When they arrived at Beaumont Plantation, Thomas gave specific orders. Elias would not work in the cotton fields. He would be assigned to domestic service and eventually help Thomas with his correspondence and books. The decision caused strangeness among the overseers, but no one questioned the colonel's son. Elias received a small room in the back of the main house, separated from the slave quarters. It was modest, just a straw bed and a candle, but had a window overlooking the cotton fields and, in the distance, the horizon where sky met earth. On the first night, Thomas went up there with the excuse of checking if the new slave was properly settled. Elias was sitting on the floor, looking out the window. He stood up immediately when Thomas entered. "Sir, can you really read?" Thomas asked, trying to sound casual. "Yes, sir. The mistress of the house where I lived in Charleston taught me when I was a child. She believed every human being should know the words of God." The way Elias said "human being" echoed in Thomas's mind. Not slave, human being. "Tomorrow you'll start helping me with my books and letters. I work better at night, after the house sleeps. You'll come to my study when I call." "As you wish, sir." Thomas should have left at that moment, but he stood there, at the door threshold, as if his feet had grown roots. "Why were you sold? If you worked in a family home—" Elias hesitated. For the first time, Thomas saw something beyond the mask of submission. He saw anger, pain, and something dangerously close to defiance. "The mistress died. Her children needed money to pay gambling debts. I was one of the most valuable assets." "Did you love her? The lady who taught you?" "She was the only person who treated me like a person." "So yes, sir, I loved her." There was silence. The night wind came through the window, carrying the smell of burning cotton. Thomas knew he should impose distance, remind Elias of his place. But instead he heard himself say, "Here you will also be treated with respect, I give you my word." Elias raised his eyes, surprised. And in that look, Thomas saw something that would make his next 6 years transform into ecstasy and torment. He saw recognition, as if Elias had seen through all the layers of privilege and power and seen the frightened man underneath. The first months were a careful dance. Thomas created a routine. After dinner, when the family retired, Elias came to the study to help him with correspondence. Officially, it was just efficiency. A literate slave organizing files, copying documents, cataloging books. But no one needed to know the sessions lasted until dawn, that they began with work and ended with conversations about philosophy, about the books Thomas brought from Europe, about the contradictions of a world that divided men between free and captive. Thomas realized Elias had an extraordinary mind. He learned fast, made connections many educated men wouldn't make. He discussed Rousseau and Voltaire with a perspective Thomas had never considered. "These philosophers speak of freedom," Elias said one night, "but how many of them have seen chains? How many felt the whip? It's easy to philosophize about human nature when you're born on the right side of history." Thomas should have been offended. Instead, he felt alive for the first time in years. "You're right," he admitted. "I read about injustice in comfortable rooms in Paris. I never lived it." "You still haven't seen anything, sir," Elias replied, with a bitterness that cut. "One day you should go to the slave quarters at night, hear the screams when the overseers drink, see the children who are born and separated from their mothers before they turn 5, see the broken men, the women." He stopped, swallowing the words he couldn't say. That conversation changed something between them. Thomas began to see his own property with different eyes. He saw the marked backs, the empty stares, the fear that pulsed through the plantation like invisible blood. He saw and was disgusted with himself. One night he found Elias in the library reading a volume of Lord Byron's poetry that Thomas had left open on the table. Elias hadn't heard him enter. He was so absorbed that he murmured the verses in a low voice, savoring each word like rare fruit. "She walks in beauty, like the night." Thomas stayed in the shadows, watching. There was something deeply intimate about seeing Elias like this, unprotected, passionate about words. When he finally made a noise, Elias startled, dropping the book as if it burned. "Forgive me, sir. I shouldn't—" "Continue," said Thomas, his voice rougher than intended. "Read to me." Elias hesitated, but obeyed. His voice transformed the English verses into music. Thomas closed his eyes and let the words envelop him, but it wasn't the verses that mattered. It was the voice. It was knowing Elias was there, just steps away, real and alive and impossible. When the poem ended, they remained in silence. The distance between them seemed both an abyss and a hair's breadth. "Byron was fascinated by the forbidden," said Thomas, the words escaping before he could stop them. "By what society condemns." "All love is forbidden to someone, sir," Elias replied softly. "It just depends on which side of the rules you were born." Their eyes met, and in that moment, Thomas knew Elias understood what Thomas could barely admit to himself. The air between them became dense, charged with something dangerous and inevitable. "Elias, Thomas began, but had no words for what he felt. How to name the impossible? Elias took a step back, breaking the spell. "It's late, sir. With your permission." "Go," said Thomas, and hated the coldness he forced into his voice. When Elias left, Thomas stood there in the dark, trembling, not from cold, but from a desire so intense it almost tore him apart. The following months were refined torture. Thomas found excuses to call Elias, to be near him. He asked him to organize books that were already organized, to reread letters already reviewed, to stay a little longer, just a little longer. And Elias, who had no choice but to obey, seemed divided between caution and something more. Sometimes Thomas caught him looking, and there was in Elias's eyes a sadness that tore him apart. It was the look of someone who sees paradise but knows they're forbidden to touch it. In December 1853, on Christmas night, the family organized a grand party, the house filled with guests, music, food. Cecilia was particularly charming in her French silk dress, and everyone commented they were the perfect couple. Thomas smiled and played his role, but felt like an actor in a play he hadn't chosen. At midnight, he escaped to the study, suffocated by falseness. He found Elias there, lighting the candles as he always did, but Thomas was drunk, not on wine, but on despair. "Do you feel it too?" The words came out before he could censor them. "Tell me it's not just me. Tell me this isn't madness." Elias stood still, the candle trembling in his hand. "Sir, you've been drinking. You should rest. Don't lie to me. Please. You're the only real thing in this house of lies." "You don't know what you're asking, sir." Elias's voice came out broken. "I'm your slave. I don't have the right to feel anything, and if I did—" He stopped, closing his eyes. "You're getting married in 3 months. You'll have children. You'll inherit all this. And I'll continue being what I've always been. Property. What if I didn't want it to be like that? What if I—" "That's forbidden," Elias whispered, and there was as much fear as desire in his voice. "What you're implying would kill us both." "I know." Thomas approached slowly, as if Elias were a wild animal about to flee. "But I can't stop thinking about you. I wake up thinking about you. I sleep thinking about you. Every book I read, every song I hear, everything leads me back to you. And I know it's wrong. I know it's sin. I know it can destroy us, but I don't care anymore." Tears ran down Elias's face. "You'll regret it, sir. When the madness passes, you'll look at me with disgust." "Never." Thomas was so close now, he could feel the heat of Elias's body. "I'm disgusted with myself for many things, but never for this. Never for you." "Then you're a fool, sir," said Elias, but his voice had no strength. "A fool who will lead us to ruin. So be it." And Thomas did what he'd been dreaming of for months. He touched Elias's face delicately, as if touching something sacred. Elias trembled under his fingers, but didn't pull away. "I understand," said Thomas. "I understand what you whispered. I understand the price, and I choose to pay it." It was Elias who closed the final distance. His kiss was of anger and surrender, of fear and desire. It was the kiss of someone jumping off a cliff knowing they'll fall, but preferring the abyss to the safety of lies. When they separated, both were crying. "This will kill us," said Elias. "Then let us die alive," Thomas replied. And on that Christmas night of 1853, while the house slept drunk from celebration, 2 men crossed the line separating the permissible from the impossible. There was no going back. There was only now, and now was all they had. But someone had seen them through the crack in the door. One of the house servants, old Martha, who had come up to check the candles. She said nothing that night. She just kept the secret like someone keeps poison, waiting for the right moment to use it. The years that followed were of torturous duplicity. During the day, Thomas was the model plantation master. He managed the crops efficiently, treated guests with charm, prepared for the wedding, postponed successive times for increasingly less convincing reasons. Cecilia was beginning to ask questions he didn't know how to answer. But at night, when shadows covered the plantation like a cloak of mercy, Thomas and Elias lived in their own world. The study had become a secret sanctuary. There was no master and slave. There were only two men trying to steal fragments of happiness from the empire of hypocrisy. Elias taught Thomas to see the world with other eyes. He took him, hidden by darkness, to the slave quarters. "Look," he said, "see what sustains your wealth." Thomas looked, and each sight was a wound that never healed. He saw mothers crying for sold children. He saw men with dead stares. He saw the daily violence he'd always known existed, but never truly confronted. Thomas began changing the plantation's practices. He prohibited the cruelest punishments. He improved rations. He allowed families to stay together. Other landowners called him weak, dangerously sentimental. His father, increasingly sick, accused him of ruining the business. "You're strange," Cecilia said one afternoon during one of her obligatory visits. "Distant. It's like I don't know you anymore." "Maybe you never really knew me," Thomas replied, and there was so much sadness in his voice that Cecilia was frightened. "Thomas, if something's wrong, if you don't want to marry me, you need to say. My father can break the engagement if—" "It's not you, Cecilia. You're kind and good and deserve someone better." "Better how? What are you talking about?" But Thomas couldn't say. How to explain his heart belonged to someone the law considered property? How to say every moment spent with her was a betrayal of the only true love he'd known? In 1856, Colonel Augustus died. Thomas inherited everything: the 3 plantations, the slaves, the debts, the power. And with that power came terrible freedom. There was no one left to question him. He could do what he wanted within the limits of his lands. Elias moved to a room adjacent to Thomas's. Officially, it was to always be available, in case the master needed something during the night. But all the slaves knew the truth. They whispered in corners. Old Martha, in particular, watched everything with snake eyes, waiting for the moment to strike. "They know," Elias said one night, lying beside Thomas. The moon came through the window, bathing them in silver. "The slaves know. It's a matter of time before someone tells the whites." "Let them tell," said Thomas, holding him tighter. "So I'll free you. We'll go north to New York or to Europe. We'll start over where no one knows us. Would you live like that?" Elias pulled away to look at him. "Exiled from everything you know? Poor? Despised? I'd live anywhere with you. I'd be happy in a cabin if you were there. You say that now, but when reality comes—" "Elias, do you think I don't know the price? I know exactly what I'm sacrificing, and you're worth more than everything. But the universe has a cruel way of collecting debts." In March 1858, Cecilia decided to make a surprise visit. She wanted to confront Thomas about the rumors reaching her ears. Rumors that he kept a slave in improper conditions, giving him privileges that caused envy and distrust. She arrived at the plantation at dusk without warning. The servants tried to stop her, but Cecilia was determined. She went up to Thomas's room. The door was ajar, and through the crack, she saw. Thomas and Elias were embraced in bed, dressed only in nightshirts. Thomas was reading in a low voice while Elias had his head resting on his chest. There was nothing sexual in the scene, but there was something infinitely more dangerous. There was love, a love so palpable it seemed to shine in the air like liquid gold. Cecilia didn't scream. She stood there, paralyzed, while her mind tried to process the impossible. Then, slowly, she backed away. She descended the stairs like a sleepwalker. She got into her carriage and ordered the coachman to take her away immediately. The next day, all of Savannah knew. Cecilia had told her parents. The parents told friends. Friends spread it through the entire county, the entire state. The scandal exploded like black powder. The engagement was broken with dishonor. The Thornton family threatened to sue Thomas for moral damages. Other landowners began avoiding him in public. The local minister refused to give him communion. Servants began abandoning the plantation. Clients cancelled contracts. Thomas became a pariah. And Elias, the catalyst of everything, became the most hated slave in Georgia. "You need to sell me," said Elias when they learned of the damage. He was pale, trembling. "You need to send me away. Say I bewitched you, that I—" "Never." Thomas held his face with both hands. "Listen to me well. Never. I'd rather die than put you in an auction again. Then we'll both die. They'll come after us." But Thomas kissed him, silencing the fears. "I made my decision long ago. I die with you or I die alone. There are no more choices." 3 days later, Thomas began feeling ill. First it was just stomach pains. Then came convulsions, blood in his saliva, burning fever. The doctor was called but couldn't identify the disease, or didn't want to. Elias didn't leave Thomas's side. He defied the overseer's orders, old Martha's threats, the barely disguised disgust of the servants who came and went from the room. He cared for Thomas as if he could keep him alive by sheer force of will. On the 4th night, Thomas knew he was dying. The poison, because it was poison he was certain, was winning. He called the notary and dictated a will before horrified witnesses. He freed Elias, left him land and money, and at the end, with his voice already failing, he added the words no one expected to hear. "Elias was not my slave. He was the love of my life, and I chose to love him even knowing the price. May God forgive me if this is sin. But I believe God, if he is merciful, understands that true love cannot be sin, regardless of the form it takes." He died at dawn on March 17, 1859, with Elias holding his hand. The last thing he saw were the eyes of the man he loved, bathed in tears that weren't just of sadness, but also of gratitude, because Thomas had given him the only gift a slave could never expect: recognition of his humanity, the right to be loved. Thomas Beaumont's funeral should have been a solemn event, worthy of a plantation master, but it transformed into a spectacle of scandal and rage. Distant relatives appeared demanding the will be annulled. The minister refused to hold a service with the body present. Neighboring planters murmured about moral corruption and divine punishment. Elias was expelled from the wake. Pushed down the stairs of the main house by one of Thomas's cousins, he fell and injured his shoulder. But he got up and didn't leave. He stayed outside during the entire burial, standing under the scorching sun, watching from afar as they placed Thomas in the earth. When everyone left, when night fell and the cemetery was empty, Elias finally approached the grave. He knelt on the still fresh earth and cried. He cried for everything they had. He cried for everything they would never have. He cried for the injustice of a world that called their love an abomination. "You were a fool," he whispered to the marble tombstone, "a brave fool, and I loved you for it." He left there the only thing of value he possessed, a small book of Byron's poetry Thomas had given him, the same book they read together on secret nights. Inside, Thomas had written in the margin, "For Elias, who taught me that freedom isn't in the chains that bind us, but in the heart that chooses to love." In the following days, a legal battle erupted. Thomas's relatives contested the will. They argued he was delirious, that he'd been coerced, that a slave couldn't inherit property. The judge, pressured by local society, seemed inclined to agree. But then something unexpected happened. The slaves of Beaumont Plantation began to speak. One by one, they went to court and testified. They told how Thomas had treated them with humanity in recent years, how he'd prohibited cruel punishments, how he'd allowed families to stay together, how he'd slowly transformed the plantation into a less hellish place. "Master Thomas wasn't crazy," said one of the older house servants. "He was in love, and he did things no plantation master would do for love. That's not madness, it's courage." Old Martha, ironically, was who sealed the will's fate. Called as a witness for the prosecution, she was asked if she'd seen anything improper. Everyone expected her to confirm the worst rumors, but Martha looked at Elias, who sat in the back of the room, thin and devastated, and something in her broke. Maybe it was pity. Maybe it was recognition that all of them, slaves and masters, were prisoners of the same brutal system. Maybe it was just exhaustion. "I saw two men who loved each other," she said in a clear voice. "I saw a master who treated a slave like a person, and I saw the slave care for the master when he was dying, even knowing he'd be blamed. If that's sin, then all love is sin, and I've seen real sins on this land. That wasn't one of them." The silence in the room was absolute. The judge, an old and tired man, sighed deeply. "The will shall be executed," he announced. "Elias will receive his freedom and his inheritance." But the "but" echoed like a shot. "But he has 24 hours to leave Georgia. If seen again in this state, he'll be arrested for vagrancy and disturbing public order. His freedom is conditional. Use it wisely." Elias didn't argue. He knew it was the best he could expect. That same night, with the clothes on his back and a small bag of belongings, he departed. Some slaves from the plantation came to say goodbye in secret. They embraced him and cried. He was a symbol for them, proof the system could be defied, even if the price was high. Before leaving, Elias returned one last time to the cemetery. He placed something else on Thomas's grave, a sealed letter. Inside he'd written, "You gave me the impossible. You gave me love when the world said I didn't deserve to be loved. You gave me freedom when it was written I should die in chains. You gave me your name, your reputation, your life, and in return, all I can give are these words. You weren't my master. You were my home, and wherever I go, I'll carry you with me. I die loving what the world commanded me to hate, and I'll die grateful for having had the courage to feel." When the sun rose over Georgia on March 20th, 1859, Elias was already far away. He headed north to states where no one knew his name or his story. He disappeared like smoke, and for a long time, everyone believed he had died, of sadness, disease, or violence on the dangerous roads of the interior. But Elias didn't die. He survived, and his survival would be the sweetest revenge against all who tried to erase his and Thomas's story. 31 years passed. The United States had fought a civil war and abolished slavery. Georgia had transformed with Reconstruction. Beaumont Plantation had been divided and sold, its lands distributed among various owners. The main house had become a school. The past seemed buried, forgotten. But in 1890, a history professor in Savannah received a mysterious package. Inside were 3 leather-bound volumes, covered in dust, Thomas Beaumont's diaries. And attached to the diaries, dozens of letters. Letters Elias had written over 3 decades, narrating his life after leaving Georgia. Elias hadn't just survived, he'd thrived. He used the inheritance money to study. He became a teacher, then a writer. He lived in Philadelphia, then in Boston. He married a kind woman who knew his story and respected it. He had children he raised free and educated. He became, quietly, one of the first black abolitionist activists in America. And during all that time, he never forgot Thomas. The letters were addressed to him as if he were still alive. "My dear Thomas," they all began, "today I saw something you would have loved." Or, "Today I taught a child to read and thought of you." Or, "Today I spoke against slavery in the public square and felt you beside me." The last letter was dated 2 weeks before sending the package. Elias was old, sick, knowing death approached. But his handwriting was still firm. "My dear Thomas, I'm about to join you wherever you are. I lived a good life. I saw slavery end. I saw our country change, but none of it would have meant anything without those 6 years we had. You gave me the greatest gift. You proved it was possible to love across all the barriers the world builds. Race, class, law. None of it mattered in the end. Only love mattered. Thank you for loving me when it was forbidden. Thank you for choosing me when it was dangerous. Thank you for dying knowing you weren't sorry. Soon I'll be with you, and this time, no one will be able to separate us." The professor, a young idealist named Samuel Porter, was deeply moved. He knew that story was social dynamite. Even decades after abolition, even after the war, the story of love between a plantation master and his slave would be scandalous, especially because it was love between men. But Samuel also knew it was important. It was proof of humanity amid barbarity. It was proof love could exist even in the most unlikely places. It was proof people were more complex than the system that imprisoned them. He decided to publish excerpts from the diaries and letters in a small literary journal in Savannah. The response was explosive. Some accused him of inventing everything, of tarnishing the memory of good families. Others congratulated him for courage. The debate dominated the city for months. But most important was what happened in quiet places, in homes where 2 men or 2 women lived together in secret, on plantations where former slaves still worked in conditions little better than before, in churches where people felt sinful for loving differently. In those places, Thomas and Elias's story became a flame of hope, proof they weren't alone, proof forbidden love had always existed, always resisted, proof it was worth fighting. In 1895, someone placed flowers on Thomas Beaumont's forgotten grave, and beside the flowers a simple note, "You were brave, and we remember." The flowers kept appearing, year after year. Sometimes they were roses, sometimes they were wild violets, but there were always flowers, and there were always notes. "Thank you for loving. Thank you for not hiding. Thank you for showing us it's possible." Beaumont Plantation became a school, then became a museum. Today, more than a century and a half later, visitors can walk the same corridors where Thomas and Elias walked. They can see the study where they read poetry by candlelight. They can touch the walls that kept their secrets. And in the cemetery, Thomas's grave now has a plaque. It doesn't tell the whole story. There's still resistance. there are still those who prefer to forget. But it says enough. Thomas Beaumont, 1831–1859, loved against the laws of his time, chose humanity over privilege. His courage echoed through the decades, and buried beside it, transferred from Boston in 1920 by descendants who honored the memory, is another grave. Elias, 1835–1890, teacher, writer, free man, loved and was loved. The graves are together now, united in death as they never could be completely in life, and on sunny mornings when light hits the marble tombstones, flowers still appear, left by people who understand, by people who know the love the South wanted to erase became proof that humanity is stronger than cruelty. The story ends, but the question remains. And you? Would you have the courage to love against the rules? Would you have the courage to choose the heart over security? Would you have the courage to be free even when the world wanted to imprison you? Thomas and Elias answered yes, and the echo of that answer still resonates, waiting for you.